Alara stood on the precipice of what was no longer hers and felt the wind steal the warmth from her skin, a petty thief taking the last of what little she had left. Below her, the valley cradled the farm with the gentle, cupped hands of a lover. It was a patchwork of greens and golds, the fields stitched together with dark, earthy seams of tilled soil. The farmhouse, with its plume of smoke rising from the chimney where another woman now cooked, was a dull ache in her chest. For 10 years, that smoke had been her own, a signal to her husband, Liam, that home was waiting. Now it was a signal that she was an outsider, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. The wind, a constant companion in this coastal land, carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, smells so familiar they felt like a violation, like reading a letter addressed to someone else. Her brother-in-law, Cormac, had been ruthlessly efficient. He had arrived a week after Liam was laid to rest in the small churchyard, his face a mask of counterfeit sorrow that barely concealed the glint of avarice in his eyes. He carried a sheaf of papers, debts Liam had apparently accrued to him over the years, signed in a hand that was a cruel forgery of her husband's familiar scrawl. The town magistrate, a man who valued the weight of Cormac's coin over the truth in a widow's eyes, had stamped the documents without a second glance. The farm, the livestock, the house filled with a decade of memories. All of it was signed over. She was given 24 hours to vacate. Cormac, in a gesture of what he called magnanimity, had pressed one final deed into her hand. A single acre of land, he'd said with a smirk, so no one could say he'd left his brother's wife entirely destitute. That acre was where she stood now. It was not land in any conventional sense. It was a joke, a final biting piece of cruelty. It was the sheer, unforgiving face of the Saltwind Spire, a towering cliff of gray and ochre sandstone that dropped 200 feet to a narrow, stony beach, where the sea gnawed relentlessly at the coast. Nothing grew here but a few defiant, wind-scoured shrubs that clung to the rock like desperate thoughts. The soil was a thin, gravelly suggestion over solid stone. It was a place of endings, a vertical graveyard where the land gave up its fight with the ocean. To the rest of the village, the spire was a landmark, a thing to be navigated around, a useless, dramatic scar on the landscape. To Cormac, it was the perfect insult. He had not just taken her home, he had given her a monument to her own powerlessness. She had spent the first few nights sleeping in a shallow cave near the base of the cliff, wrapped in the one good blanket she had been allowed to take. The salt spray misted her face as she slept, and the ceaseless roar of the waves became the rhythm of her grief. Despair was a cold, heavy stone in her belly. She watched the gulls wheeling in the sky, their cries like shards of glass, and felt a kinship with their wild, lonely existence. They asked for nothing but a place to land, and the world gave them wind and rock. The village, nestled in the valley behind her, was a collection of distant, flickering lights that offered no warmth. She heard the whispers when she went to the well for water. The poor thing. Lost her wits along with her husband, living on the rocks like a seabird. Pity was a bitter draught, and she learned to fetch her water at dawn, when the paths were empty and the judgment of others was still asleep. It was on the 5th morning, as the sun broke over the pewter-gray sea, that the idea first began to stir. It was not a flash of lightning but a slow dawn, a gradual illumination of a thought that had been hidden in the shadows of her memory. She was watching the wind, not just feeling it. She saw how it moved, a living, breathing entity. It did not simply crash against the spire. It flowed over and around it, accelerating as it was squeezed through fissures and gullies. A particular crevice, a deep vertical scar running halfway up the cliff face, seemed to inhale the wind, pulling it inward with a low, mournful whistle. The air that came out the other side, she noticed, was drier, stripped of its oceanic dampness by its passage through the porous stone. The memory came then, sharp and clear as a winter morning. It was her grandmother, a woman from the windswept northern isles where trees grew sideways and survival was an art form. Alara had been a small child, sitting by the hearth, watching her grandmother hang salted fish from the rafters. "The wind is a patient butcher, little bird," the old woman had said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "It slices the water from the flesh, leaves only the salt and the spirit. But you must give it the right knife. A stone knife, a house of stone that breathes." Her grandmother had spoken of sea caves and cliff hollows where the wind was a constant, tireless worker, curing meat and fish better than any smokehouse, leaving it with the clean, sharp taste of the ocean itself. Alara looked at the salt wind spire again, her eyes tracing the lines and cracks not as flaws, but as possibilities. The cliff was not a wall. It was not an ending. It was a tool. A massive, perpendicular engine powered by the wind and the sun. The porous sandstone would act like a lung, breathing in the salt-laden air and exhaling dry, preserving currents. The sun that baked the western face in the afternoons would provide the gentle, consistent warmth needed for the initial stages of curing. The sheer verticality meant she could build upwards, creating space where there was none. She could carve a smokehouse into the rock, a vertical cathedral of preservation hidden in plain sight. The idea was so audacious, so contrary to every bit of conventional wisdom, that it felt like a madness. But it was a madness that sang to her, a single clear note in the cacophony of her grief. It was a plan born not of hope, but of necessity. She had nothing left to lose, and this useless cliff was all she had. The laughter from the village would be merciless. Cormac's mockery would be unbearable. But the thought of their scorn was a distant fire compared to the cold, encroaching tide of destitution. She had a choice: to fade away into a cautionary tale whispered by the well, or to take a hammer to the rock and carve out a future. Her hands, soft from years of kneading dough and tending a garden, were ill-suited for the task. Her body, weary with sorrow, felt unequal to the labor. But a stubborn root of defiance, a trait inherited from her grandmother of the Isles, began to push its way through the barren soil of her despair. She walked to the village that afternoon, her back straight, her gaze fixed. She went not to the magistrate or the merchants, but to the one man who might listen without immediate ridicule, Mr. Silas, the blacksmith. He was a man built of the same iron and smoke as his trade, with arms like knotted oak and a face that seemed permanently smudged with soot. He had been fond of Liam, and had always treated Alara with a gruff, paternal respect. She found him at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a steady heartbeat in the village air. He stopped his work when he saw her, his hammer falling silent. He wiped a grimy hand across his forehead, his expression a mixture of pity and concern. "Alara, it is not good for you to be out here. The cliff is no place for a woman alone." "I need you to make me something, Mr. Silas," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "And I need to buy your smallest, sturdiest pickaxe and a good stone hammer." He looked at her, his brows furrowed. "Tools? What for? You're not planning on farming that rock, are you?" The question was gentle, but the underlying assumption was clear. She was addled with grief. "I have a project," she said simply, unwilling to expose her fragile, nascent idea to the harsh light of his practicality just yet. She described what she wanted: a series of long, chisel-pointed iron rods, tempered for hardness, and several heavy-duty rings that could be hammered into rock. She paid him with the last of the silver coins she had managed to hide from Cormac, a pathetic handful that barely covered the cost of the metal. Silas took the coins reluctantly. "This is folly, girl," he mumbled, shaking his head as he examined a piece of bar iron. "Whatever you're planning, the spire is a dangerous place. The wind will take you, or the rock will." But he was a man of his word. He fired the forge, the bellows breathing a fiery life into the coals, and began to work. He did not ask any more questions, and for that Ilara was grateful. She watched the iron glow and bend under his hammer, seeing not just tools, but the keys to her survival. The work began the next day. The sheer physical reality of it was a brutal shock. Her plan, so elegant in her mind, was a clumsy, agonizing struggle in practice. The sandstone was harder than she had anticipated, a dense, layered composite that fought back against her every blow. The pickaxe jarred her arms and shoulders until they screamed with a fiery, unfamiliar pain. Each swing felt like a betrayal of her own body. The first day, she managed to chip out a space no larger than a dinner plate, a pathetic scar on the immense face of the rock. Her hands were raw, blistered, and bleeding by noon. She sat on the stony ground, weeping with frustration and exhaustion, the taste of salt on her lips a mixture of the sea and her own tears. But she did not stop. Each morning she returned, her muscles aching, her resolve a brittle, fragile thing. She learned the language of the stone, its grain, its weaknesses. She discovered that by pouring seawater on the rock and letting the sun bake it, the salt crystals would expand in the tiny pores, making the surface more friable. She learned to use the hammer not with brute force, but with a rhythmic, patient percussion that found the rock's resonant frequency, causing it to fracture more cleanly. Her body began to change. The softness of the farmer's wife was burned away, replaced by the lean, hard muscle of a quarry worker. Her hands became calloused and strong, the skin thick as leather. She was no longer just a widow. She was a creature of the cliff, her existence defined by the daily battle with the stone. The village watched her. At first it was with pitying amusement. Children would dare each other to run to the base of the spire and shout up at the cliff witch. Women would whisper as she passed, their words like stinging insects. "She's digging her own grave," they'd say. Cormac would sometimes ride his horse to the edge of his fields, the fields that should have been hers, and watch her, a tiny figure toiling on the rock face. His laughter would drift on the wind, a sound more cutting than any shard of stone. He called her the Stone Pecker, a name that quickly spread through the village. Mr. Silas was her only regular visitor. He would come once a week, ostensibly to bring her the sharpened points of her picks, but she knew he came to make sure she was still alive. He would stand at a safe distance, watching her work, his face a mask of grim disbelief. "You'll break your back before you break that rock," he told her one afternoon, his voice heavy with concern. "What is it you're even trying to do, Ilara? There's no shame in asking for help. The parish can find you a room, some work." She paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a gritty hand. She had made progress. The shallow scar had become a small alcove, deep enough for her to shelter from the rain. "I am building a house, Mr. Silas," she said, looking him directly in the eye. "A house for a business." He stared at the hole she had carved. It looked less like a house and more like the den of some desperate animal. He shook his head slowly. "You're building a tomb." He left her a small loaf of bread and a piece of cheese on a rock and walked away, his shoulders slumped. His pity was harder to bear than Cormac's scorn. It implied she was a lost cause, a fragile thing to be cared for, not a force to be reckoned with. It fueled her determination. She would show him. She would show them all. Months bled into a year. The alcove became a chamber, a small circular room carved into the heart of the cliff. It was slow, arduous work. She used the iron rings Silas had made her as anchor points for a rope and a precarious wooden plank, allowing her to work higher up the face. She learned to move across the rock with the careful, deliberate grace of an insect, her fear of heights dissolving into a focused concentration. The chamber was only the beginning. From it she began to tunnel upwards, following the natural fissure she had first observed. She was not just digging, she was sculpting the airflow, creating a vertical chimney that would draw the sea air through the stone. Her project began to take on a strange, undeniable logic. She carved smaller side chambers off the main shaft, each with carefully angled vents that faced the prevailing winds. She lined the floors with smooth, flat stones harvested from the beach below, stones that would be easy to clean. She devised a system of wooden racks, made from driftwood and rope, that could be raised and lowered through the central shaft. It was an intricate, three-dimensional puzzle, and she was solving it one hammer blow at a time. The inside of the cliff began to resemble a giant, porous lung, designed to breathe in the sea and exhale preservation. One day, as she was hauling a basket of crushed rock out of the entrance, she saw Cormac watching her again. This time he was not laughing. He was standing with the town magistrate, and their expressions were ones of sour confusion. Her project was no longer a madwoman's folly. It was an inexplicable and therefore unsettling construction. It was an affront to the natural order of things. Land was for farming or building upon, not for burrowing into like a mole. "What is the meaning of this excavation?" the magistrate called up to her, his voice thin against the wind. "You are destabilizing the spire. It is a danger to the fishing boats below." "The spire has stood for 1,000 years, Alara shouted back, her voice hoarse from stone dust. "It is not afraid of one woman with a hammer. This is my land. The deed is in your office." Cormac stepped forward. "This is an eyesore, a disgrace. She is bringing shame to my brother's name with this madness." Alara felt a hot surge of anger. "Your brother's name was never mentioned when you were forging his signature," she retorted. The magistrate flushed, and Cormac's face darkened with rage. They had no legal grounds to stop her, and they knew it. They left, muttering threats and dark predictions. The confrontation left her shaken, but also strangely invigorated. Their opposition was a sign that she was no longer an object of pity. She was a problem, and problems had to be acknowledged. She knew the time had come to test her creation. She took the last of her money and bought a small catch of mackerel from a young fisherman who looked at her with wide, curious eyes. She took the fish back to her cliff home, cleaned them with practiced efficiency, and salted them heavily with salt she had patiently evaporated from seawater in shallow rock pools. Then, with a deep breath, she hung the glistening fish on the racks in her highest, most wind-exposed chamber. She sealed the entrance and waited. The sounds from within the cliff were new. It was no longer just the whistle of wind through a crack. It was a deep, resonant hum, the sound of a massive instrument being played by the sea. The entire structure seemed to be alive, breathing. She placed her hand on the interior wall and could feel a faint, steady vibration as the air currents moved through the labyrinth she had created. For 3 days she waited, her anxiety a tight knot in her stomach. Had she miscalculated? Was her grandmother's wisdom just the rambling of an old woman? Had she spent a year of her life carving her own monument to failure? On the 4th morning, she opened the chamber. A blast of cool, dry, salty air rushed out to greet her. It smelled clean, like the open ocean on a cold day. The fish were transformed. They were firm, dry to the touch, and coated in a delicate, powdery layer of salt. The flesh, when she broke a piece off, was a deep, translucent pink. It was perfect. It was better than perfect. The flavor was unlike anything she had ever tasted. Not smoky and heavy like traditional cured fish, but clean, briny, and intensely savory, with a hint of the stone itself, a mineral tang that was the signature of the spire. She took a small basket of her cured fish to the village market. She did not have a stall, so she simply stood at the edge of the square, a silent figure in worn, dust-covered clothes. People ignored her at first, hurrying past the strange cliff witch. But the unique, enticing smell of the fish began to cut through the other market smells of sawdust and livestock. A few curious people stopped. She offered a small piece to a skeptical fisherman. He chewed it slowly, his expression shifting from suspicion to surprise, then to outright astonishment. "By the tides," he whispered. "What did you do to this?" Before the end of the day, she had sold every last piece. She had enough money to buy a much larger catch and a side of pork from a farmer on the other side of the valley. Her business had been born. The cliff witch was now grudgingly the fish woman. Her product was undeniable. The fishermen, who often lost a portion of their catch to spoilage before it could be sold, began to bring their surplus to her. The farmers, who struggled to preserve their meat through the damp, mold-inducing winters, began to approach her with quiet inquiries. Ilara's enterprise grew, one salted fish, one cured ham at a time. She carved more chambers, hired the young fishermen who had first bought her wares to help her, and built a sturdy winch system designed by a now deeply impressed Mr. Silas. The blacksmith had come to her cliff a week after her first market day, a piece of her fish in his hand. He had taken one bite, looked from the fish to the impossible structure carved into the rock, and then back to her. He did not say, "I was wrong." He did not have to. Instead, he said, "You're going to need a bigger hoist," and forged steel hooks. The wood will rot in the salt air. From that day on, he was her staunchest ally. Cormac watched her growing success with a venomous envy. His farm was profitable, but it was conventional. It produced the same wheat, the same wool, the same livestock as every other farm in the valley. Ilara's business was unique. It was alchemy. She was turning worthless rock and cheap fish into something rare and valuable. He tried to compete, building a large traditional smokehouse on his property. But his smoked meats were heavy, greasy, and prone to spoilage in the damp climate. He couldn't replicate the magic of the spire. His failure only deepened his resentment. For 2 years, Ilara's business flourished. She was no longer destitute. She was comfortable, respected, and largely left alone. The whispers had not stopped, but their tone had changed from mockery to a kind of grudging awe. The Saltwind Spire was no longer a symbol of her shame, but a testament to her ingenuity. She had carved a life not just from the rock, but into it. But the greatest test of her creation, and her own spirit, was yet to come. It would arrive, as most momentous events in that part of the world did, on the back of a furious storm. The storm was a monster, a howling beast born in the cold, gray heart of the Northern Ocean. It fell upon the coast without warning, turning the mid-autumn sky to a bruised, violent twilight. For 3 days and 3 nights, the wind shrieked, and the sea rose in a mountainous rage. Ships were torn from their moorings, and fishing boats were smashed to splinters against the rocks. The village huddled in their homes, listening to the storm dismantle the world outside. Ilara, safe in her stone chambers, felt the spire tremble with the impact of the waves, the whole cliff humming like a cello string. She was deep in the earth's embrace, secure and dry, a passenger in the storm, not its victim. When the storm finally broke, the dawn revealed a scene of devastation. The harbor was a graveyard of broken masts and splintered hulls. But it also revealed something else. Huddled in the relative shelter of the bay was a sight that made the entire village gasp: the King's Grand Armada. Nearly 50 warships, the pride of the Royal Navy, had been caught by the storm while on maneuvers, and had run for the nearest safe harbor. They were battered and damaged, but they were intact. Their arrival, however, brought a problem of a scale the small coastal region was utterly unprepared for. A contingent of grim-faced naval officers, led by a stern, silver-haired quartermaster, rode into the village that morning. Their message was blunt and urgent. The storm had ruined their provisions. The holds of their ships had been flooded with seawater, spoiling tens of thousands of pounds of hardtack, salted beef, and flour. 5,000 sailors and marines, the backbone of the kingdom's defense, were now stranded with barely a day's worth of edible rations. They needed to reprovision, and they needed to do it immediately. The quartermaster announced that the crown would pay a king's ransom in gold for any and all preserved foodstuffs that could be delivered within the week. A frantic energy seized the valley. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Cormac saw his chance for a fortune that would dwarf Alara's small enterprise. He strode into the emergency meeting at the town hall with the swagger of a man who believed he was born to lead. He promised the quartermaster mountains of smoked hams, cured bacon, and salted mutton. He rallied the other landowners, convincing them to slaughter their livestock and pool their resources, with him acting as the central broker. He would build the biggest smokehouses the valley had ever seen, he boasted. He would feed the entire fleet himself. The quartermaster, a man named Captain Valerius, looked at Cormac with cold, appraising eyes. "Your ambition is noted, Mr. Cormac. But can you deliver? Smoking meat takes weeks, and the traditional salt curing process is little faster. I have 5,000 hungry men. They need to eat now, not next month." "The weather is turning cold and dry after the storm," Cormac argued, puffing out his chest. "Perfect conditions. We will work day and night. We will deliver." Valerius remained unconvinced, his gaze sweeping over the assembled farmers and merchants. His eyes held the weary pragmatism of a man who had heard 1,000 such boasts and seen most of them fail. It was then that Mr. Silas, who had been standing silently at the back of the hall, spoke up. "There is another way," he said, his deep voice cutting through the excited chatter. "A faster way, a better way." All eyes turned to him. Cormac scoffed. "And what would you know of it, blacksmith? Will you forge them a meal from your anvil?" Silas ignored him, his eyes fixed on the quartermaster. "There is a woman here, Alara. She has a process. She can cure meat and fish in a matter of days, not weeks. And the quality is unmatched." A murmur went through the crowd. The Cliff Witch. The idea was absurd. Captain Valerius raised a skeptical eyebrow. "A woman with a secret process? It sounds like a village fable." "It is no fable," Silas insisted, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised everyone. "Go and see for yourself. See the Saltwind Spire." Intrigued despite himself and with the desperation of his situation overriding his skepticism, Valerius agreed. He rode out to the spire, his retinue of officers trailing behind him, their fine uniforms a stark contrast to the wild, rocky landscape. Cormac, smelling a threat to his grand plan, insisted on accompanying them, his face a mask of scornful amusement. They found Alara not at the base of the cliff, but near the top, supervising her small team as they used the winch to haul up massive baskets of fish purchased from the flotilla of small boats that had already resumed their work. She was covered in salt and dust, her hair tied back in a practical knot, and she moved with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute competence. She was not intimidated by the arrival of the uniformed men. She simply paused her work and waited. "This is your miracle worker?" Cormac sneered, gesturing at Alara and the hole in the rock. "A woman living in a cave, curing a few fish for pocket money." Captain Valerius silenced him with a sharp look. He dismounted and approached the cliff, his eyes scanning the intricate system of ropes and pulleys, the sheer face of the rock, and the dark, yawning entrance to the main chamber. He was a man who understood engineering, logistics, and the brutal realities of survival at sea. He was looking at the spire not as a farmer would, but as a military engineer. He saw not a madwoman's den, but a brilliantly designed, naturally powered processing facility. "Show me," he said to Alara. His voice was not a request, but a command. Without a word, Alara led him inside. The officers and a fuming Cormac followed. The air within was cool, dry, and filled with the clean, sharp scent of salt and curing meat. It was a stark contrast to the damp, smoky air of a traditional smokehouse. Valerius ran a hand along the stone wall, feeling the faint vibration of the wind moving through the rock. He looked up the central shaft, a vertical tunnel that disappeared into the darkness above, and saw the outlines of dozens of racks laden with produce. Alara lit a lantern, and the true scale of her operation was revealed. The cliff was not a cave. It was a honeycomb. Chamber after chamber, tunnel after tunnel, all interconnected, all designed to channel the preserving wind. It was vast, far larger than anyone from the village had ever imagined. "How much can you process?" Valerius asked, his voice now devoid of skepticism, replaced by a tone of sharp, professional interest. "With the winds as they are now," Alara said calmly, "I can fully cure a side of beef in 5 days. A whole hog in 4. Fish, less than 2. The spire is working at its peak." One of the junior officers gasped. Such speeds were unheard of. It was impossible. Cormac laughed out loud. "She lies. It's a trick. The meat will be rotten." Alara turned her cool gaze on him. "My product has never spoiled, Cormac. Unlike the hams from your last autumn slaughter, half of which were green with mold by midwinter." Cormac's face went white with fury. The jab had hit its mark, a well-known secret in the valley. Valerius ignored the exchange. He walked to one of the racks and took down a piece of cured mutton. He inspected it, smelled it, and then sliced off a thin piece with a small knife from his belt. He chewed it thoughtfully, his eyes closed. The other officers watched, holding their breath. He swallowed, and then a slow smile spread across his stern face. "Extraordinary," he whispered. "Absolutely extraordinary. The flavor is clean. The preservation is perfect. There's no smoke, no grease. Just salt and meat and stone." He turned to Alara, his eyes shining with the light of a man who has found the solution to an impossible problem. "Can you feed my men, madam?" "I can," Alara replied. "But I will need more produce than I can source alone. I will need every spare fish, every pig, every head of cattle in this valley. And I will need them immediately." The deal was struck. The Crown would commandeer all available livestock and fish, paying a fair price to the owners. All of it was to be delivered to Alara at the Saltwind Spire for processing. She was given a contract that made the magistrate's eyes water, and a down payment in gold that was more money than the entire village saw in a year. The next few days were a blur of frantic, organized activity. The valley was transformed into a massive supply chain, feeding a single, rock-hewn stomach. Farmers who had once mocked Alara now lined up to sell her their finest animals. Fishermen bypassed the market entirely, bringing their catches straight to her beach. Mr. Silas fired up his forge and, with 3 apprentices, worked around the clock, creating hundreds of specialized steel hooks and strengthening the winch mechanism. The entire community, bound by the authority of the Crown and the promise of gold, became her workforce. And at the center of it all was Cormac, humiliated. His grand plan was in ashes. He was forced, by royal decree, to sell his own prize-winning livestock to the very woman he had dispossessed and ridiculed. He stood, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage, as his cattle were led away towards the spire. He was just another supplier, a minor cog in the machine that Alara had built. For 6 days the spire devoured the valley's bounty. The hum of the wind through its chambers deepened into a constant, resonant roar. Alara did not sleep for more than an hour at a time. She was everywhere, directing the butchering on the beach, supervising the salting, managing the complex rotation of the racks within the cliff, ensuring every piece of meat was perfectly placed to catch the curing drafts. She was no longer the cliff witch or the stone pecker. She was the commander, her authority absolute and unquestioned. On the 7th day, the first of the great wagons, loaded with perfectly cured, salt-dusted meat and fish, rolled down from the spire and towards the harbor. A steady stream of them followed, a river of sustenance flowing from the rock to the sea. The sailors, who had been subsisting on thin gruel, let out a cheer that echoed across the bay. Captain Valerius stood on the quay, personally inspecting the cargo. He picked up a piece of the cured beef, its color a deep, rich mahogany, and held it up to the light. He turned to Alara, who stood beside him, weary but resolute. "You have done the impossible, madam," he said, his voice filled with a profound respect. "You have not just fed my men. You have saved the king's armada. The crown is in your debt." He made a formal bow, a gesture of deference that stunned the onlookers. In the end, she fed them all. 5,000 men. She delivered tens of thousands of pounds of preserved food, enough for the fleet to sail home and then some. The final payment of gold was a staggering sum. The aftermath was a complete reordering of her world. The villagers no longer saw a madwoman. They saw a savior, a genius, an architect of fortune. They now called her the Spire Maiden. The name held a mythical weight, as if she were a force of nature, inseparable from the cliff she had mastered. They came to her not with pity, but with proposals. They wanted her to expand, to process their goods for the wider markets. Her method, the salt wind cure, became famous. Merchants from the capital city traveled to her remote cliff to buy her unique product. She did not buy back the farm. The valley felt too small for her now. The farmhouse a cage of memories she had no desire to re-enter. Instead, she bought the harbor. The entire waterfront, the quays, the warehouses, the fishing fleet. She built a new life on the edge of the sea, her back to the land that had rejected her, and her face to the wind that had saved her. Cormac, his reputation shattered and his finances diminished, eventually sold the farm and moved away, a bitter, forgotten man. Years passed. The Spire became a thriving city of industry, honeycombed with new chambers, its face crisscrossed with ingenious lifts and cranes. Alara never married again. She had wedded herself to the rock, to the wind, and to her own indomitable will. She taught her methods to others, and the salt wind cure brought a wave of prosperity to the entire coastline, lifting families out of the precarious existence of subsistence farming and fishing. Decades later, long after Alara had passed, her story was told to children who sat by the fire on stormy nights. It was a story about a woman who had lost everything and, in her grief, had listened. She had listened not to the shouts of the world, to the mockery and the doubt and the conventional wisdom that screamed impossible. She had listened instead to the whisper of the wind, to the quiet, patient language of the stone. The world had given her a worthless rock, a symbol of her defeat, and she had looked at it not with the eyes of a farmer, but with the vision of an engineer, a poet, and a survivor. She had understood that the greatest obstacles are often the greatest tools in disguise, and that a foundation of solid rock, though barren, is the only thing that can truly withstand the storm. She had carved her legacy not upon the soft, yielding earth, but into the unyielding heart of the world itself.